fantasy prevents sex from flowing from the mental and spiritual unity of two persons. Instead, it becomes the solitary act of the self-willed person, in which he or she is not in a relationship with his partner, but with the fantasy, that is, with themselves. Welcome back to my channel. We're going through the Sermon on the Mount, verse by verse, and the next verse says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." This is probably the most famous, or maybe the most infamous part of the Sermon on the Mount, because this is the verse because of which many have dismissed Jesus as utopian, unrealistic, impractical, and even ascetic. Because without sex, as the reality, life on this planet could not continue. And the union between a man and a woman would lose a lot: intimacy, beauty, and fruitfulness. Therefore, such a stance was considered unreal and excessive. However, Jesus is not downplaying sexuality here. A negative attitude towards sexuality does not come from the Bible, but from paganism, in which sexuality is excessively emphasized on one hand to the point of perversion, and then in a knee-jerk reaction denied completely to the point of abstinence. In the Bible, sex is a natural, God-given ability for human beings to be intimate to the point of becoming one flesh, and the result of which is children, which means the expansion of the family and the increase in power and security. In Genesis, God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Therefore, the difference between the sexes is part of the order of creation, a means of extending power and security, and has nothing to do with sin. When Adam saw the woman, the text suddenly turns into poetry. The Hebrew text turns into poetry. Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed." The verb to leave is very strong in Hebrew and has a strong connotation of giving up, even renouncing. Man and woman separate from their families of origin to unite on all levels and create something new. Physically, they're completely naked. Psychologically, they're emotionally naked, open, and drawn to one another to the point of complete mutual identification, which is seen in the single name they bear, Adam. That was the name before the fall. Woman was named after the fall. She was named Eve, but only after the fall. Before the fall, they were both Adam. Spiritually, they trust in the wisdom of each other's choices and mutually surrender to the direction the other one leads to. Even when one decides to choose death, the other one will follow. Is it then strange, because they were so open towards one another and so one with one another, is it strange that they were not ashamed of being naked? In the Torah, sexuality is depicted as something to be enjoyed without shame, within the framework of a secure relationship of mutual love, trust, and loyalty. If Jesus had condemned sexuality, he would not have fulfilled the law with the correct interpretation but abolished it. Therefore, he's saying something else here. First, he quotes the seventh commandment of the Decalogue, which says, "You shall not commit adultery." And then, in his interpretation, he connects this commandment with the 10th commandment that says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox," etc., etc. This appears to be the principle for all other commandments that forbid causing harm to others. Jesus, in interpretation, he connects them with the 10th commandment. Secondly, in his interpretation, Jesus does not speak of another man's wife, but of a woman in general, thereby extending the application of the commandment on adultery, the seventh commandment, to both unmarried and married people. Thirdly, in his saying, "Whoever looks at a woman to lust," the word for lust does not have sexual connotation, but rather refers to a general desire for possession, a person's eagerness for something or someone, which includes also lust. Literally, this text means whoever looks at any woman with the intention of lusting after her. However, this text can also be translated as anyone who looks at any woman with the intention of causing her longing. Therefore, we have ambiguity here. Me personally, when a text is ambiguous, I tend to accept both meanings, especially when they do not conflict with the main point. Fourth, the main point is that he has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That's the main point. Therefore, adultery is not an act of the body, but a state of mind that includes the orientation of the will. The body merely acts in accordance with the mind and will, but even if it does not follow them due to a lack of opportunity or the threat of punishment, the mind and will are still in a state of adultery. Only it does not manifest itself at the level of the body. It's not visible, but at the level of inclination and imagination. That means that what makes an adulterer is not what he has not done for whatever reason, but what he longs for, the orientation of his will, and what he would certainly do if he had or she had the chance or access and there were no consequences. Fifth, the translation of the root for adultery is desecration, profanation, the degradation of a person by encouraging them to break an oath. Therefore, Jesus interprets adultery much more broadly. The essence of the adultery is not only the illicit sexual act, but the desire that reduces the predator to an impulse and the victim to an object, thereby wounding them both spiritually. The problem is not sexuality, but the spirit of people who are self-willed. The desire Jesus speaks of has nothing to do with sex, nor with anything physical. Illicit sexual act is often just an outer shell for something much more serious and darker, and that is fantasy, which parasitically projects itself onto another person. The result is that the other person is not experienced as a person per se, but as an object for fulfilling the self-willed person's desire for themselves. Fantasy prevents sex from flowing from the mental and spiritual unity of two persons. Instead, it becomes the solitary act of the self-willed person, in which he or she is not in a relationship with his partner, but with the fantasy, that is, with themselves. This is why lust is solitary, because due to projection, it never truly experiences the other person. The partner can even become a hindrance, as their real desires and concerns can spoil the fantasy. This means that the desire or the fantasy can exist without sex, even in people who can no longer perform it because of the age. This is precisely the measure of the application of this interpretation of Jesus. He says that an adulterer is anyone who on a spiritual level harbors a desire for another person in a way that does not unite two persons into one, two people into one flesh, but rather ignores the partner's personality and literally turns them into a fetish. For if a fetish is a sexual desire attached to an object, and if fantasy objectifies a person, then that person ceases to be a person, basically, and essentially becomes a fetish. Jesus is speaking of the capacity of human heart to be misdirected and to perceive everything upside down. All people can do this too. Sometimes, in some cases, that is all they enjoy doing. Such fantasy-based desires paint what we project onto the world, and people can sense it as something that contaminates them. Not sex, but the desire that objectifies another person is what contaminates a person from the inside, becoming visible in their eyes, facial expression, and body language through which they enter public spaces, and these public spaces become contaminated. A look is a public act with public consequences and has potential to establish a hierarchy of power and dictate social relations. When, for example, a boss looks at a new secretary in a certain way, this look can change the entire hierarchy within the company. But a look rarely ends with just a look. When people get comfortable enough, the gaze is always accompanied by a certain degree of inappropriate behavior. For example, inappropriate flirting, suggestive language, provocations, and even uncontrollable nervous gestures that give away people. Today, this is called sexual harassment and is the source of much distress. Sexual harassment is not a left-wing fabrication aimed at persecuting men, but rather stems from Jesus' interpretation of the law. The result of sexual harassment is a feeling of mental assault, even though nothing physical has ever happened. The person who is the object of the fantasy feels foolish and disenfranchised. On the other hand, adultery is not just a fantasy that has grown into a desire that can be seen in the eyes, but also the seduction of the gaze, suggestion, the creation of a fantasy in another, and the exciting the lust in another person. Many women have understood how inner desire works and have found ways to exploit it. It is enough for a woman to strategically reduce herself to a fantasy, and the adultery is already sown. Fantasy and desire are so powerful that a physical act of adultery doesn't even have to occur for its presence to be felt in the room. If you're wondering why there are categories of women who do not need to have any skills whatsoever or knowledge to get a good job and paid well, that is because of men who harbor adulterous desires. The only example that I need to quote here is OnlyFans website. This is so widespread today through social media that adultery has become a norm without which many people cannot imagine their normal life. In his interpretation of the law, Jesus says that this is far from normal. People that went through a paradigm shift have no desires based on fantasy. For them, beauty is simply just beauty, not a fulfillment of their fantasies. For them, partnership is beautiful even after sex is over, because the beauty is in giving, not in fulfillment of fantasies and desires for their own sake. Their identity is not reduced to their sexuality, and this frees them from the frustrations imposed by a culture that sexualizes everything. If their gaze were to contain fantasy and the desire for possession of another person, they will no longer be a light to the world, but creeps and seductresses. This interpretation makes sense and brings a great deal of freedom. First and foremost, if a person wants to be a peacemaker, they must have peace in themselves, which they can then spread to others. A person who is frustrated by fantasies, the sexualization of others, and possessive desires cannot have peace. They have restlessness and hunger that endlessly deepen and intensify. The only way to attain and maintain peace is to guard one's own eyes. Patriarch Job knew this very well. He said, "I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her." Transformed peacemakers live before God in this way. They are careful what they look at and what thoughts result from what they are seeing. Just as murder is only the concrete outcome of anger that grows into hatred, so too is adultery only the concrete outcome of a gaze that turns into fantasy. Of course, peacemakers do not walk through the world with their eyes closed, but in agreement between the eyes and the heart, so that what the eyes see do not turn into a thought and a desire that will extinguish the light in their heart and transform their hearts into a source of darkness. Basically, they remain free from the cheese in the mousetrap. They don't play the game. They abandon the dating scene in which men and women are commodities for the gratification of intimate fantasies. They become free from the cynicism of war between sexes as well. It becomes possible for them to form genuine male-female relationships and friendships because they are relaxed, they are free from the tension created by lust. They do not hypocritically pretend to be friends just to gain access to someone's vulnerabilities, where they can, without warning, just turn around and reveal their true intentions, thus shattering trust so completely that everything feels like incest. The peacemakers live from a liberated mind, truly listening and hearing what the other person is saying and thinking, without ulterior motives or daydreams that eventually begin to show in their gaze. They do not perceive others as objects, but as individuals, and this spills over from their heart. A genuine interest in real, conscious, vulnerable people who have their own dreams and ambitions and do not view them as fetishes. They can be in the presence of infinite beauty and vulnerability and still remain themselves, not lose their breath, and their thoughts do not become sexualized. You have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Peacemakers avoid this through the mutual understanding between the heart and the eyes. A pure heart emits light through the gaze, and pure eyes ensure they do not defile the heart.